The letters did not explode into public view with a press conference, a royal statement, or some grand palace confession, and that is exactly why they felt so dangerous. Because the most unsettling royal stories are never the ones announced beneath chandeliers, they are the ones that slip out. Quietly, folded inside whispers, buried beneath polite smiles, hidden behind doors that closed just a second too fast, and this time the whisper was brutal. Private letters had surfaced, and those letters allegedly showed Prince William doing something that sent a chill through the old royal guard. Quietly, carefully, almost surgically restructuring a state power away from Camilla's orbit while the world was distracted by ceremony, tradition, and those perfect public photographs designed to make everything look calm when it was anything but calm. Because on the surface, it looked tidy, administrative, almost boring if you did not know how royal power actually works, but underneath that neat surface was a different story entirely. One of influence being reduced, access being narrowed, loyalties being tested, and names that once moved. Easily through private estate conversations, suddenly finding the temperature drop. No screaming match, no slam door, no dramatic public fallout, just paper. Quiet paper. The kind of paper that changes everything. And that is what made this so explosive. These were not random notes or harmless planning memos. The talk inside royal circles, the kind that spreads through staff corridors faster than any official briefing, was that these letters mapped out a subtle but unmistakable shift. A redrawing of who gets heard, who gets hired, who gets trusted, and maybe most painfully of all, who gets left outside. The room. And if that is true, then this was never just about property. It was about power. It was about memory. It was about Prince William looking at the empire placed in his hands and deciding that inherited structure did not mean inherited loyalties. Because ever since the Duchy landed under William's authority, there has been this feeling, faint at first, almost deniable, that he was not simply managing an estate, he was cleansing a network, reviewing who belonged to the old chapter and who would be allowed into the next one. And when people close to Camilla's side reportedly noticed that certain familiar lines of influence were thinning out, the alarm bells did not ring publicly, but behind the scenes, they rang loud, very loud. Suddenly, long-standing comfort began to look temporary. Old assumptions began to crack. The unspoken privilege of proximity started to feel less like a guarantee and more like a privilege with an expiration date. And now these alleged letters, these deeply private communications that were never supposed to become a story, have thrown gasoline on every suspicion already floating through palace air. Because if William truly put those thoughts into writing, if he really outlined plans to modernize estate control by removing soft family-linked influence and tightening the circle around people he personally trusted, then this was not drift. This was not coincidence. This was intention. Cold, elegant, royal intention. The kind that never raises its voice because it does not need to. It already knows where the power sits. And you have to understand why this would hit such a raw nerve. Camilla's rise inside royal life did not happen in a vacuum. It came through years of controversy, endurance, careful image rebuilding, and gradual acceptance after one of the most emotionally loaded love triangles in modern royal history. Nothing about her position was simple, and nothing about the people around her was ever viewed as neutral. So when William, Diana's son, the future king, begins quietly reorganizing the machinery of private estate authority in ways that appear to reduce Camilla-linked influence, even if nobody says the words out loud, the symbolism screams. It screams. Because this is not just a son managing land, this is a son managing legacy. This is a future monarch deciding what survives from his father's era and what does not. And maybe that is why the alleged wording in these letters caused such a stir among insiders. Because according to the whisper chain, the language was calm but unmistakable, less emotional than strategic, less personal than final, stressing efficiency, independence, cleaner oversight, and a more direct internal chain of trust. That may sound harmless to the public, but inside palace logic, those words can be lethal. Efficiency can mean removal. Oversight can mean distrust. Restructuring can mean someone powerful just lost their invisible key. The most fascinating part is that William never has to openly attack anyone for the message to land. He does not need a feud on camera. He does not need a dramatic quote. All he has to do is change who signs off, who advises, who decorates, who handles the private details, who gets copied into the next letter, and who suddenly does not. That is how royal power evolves now, not with crowns crashing to the floor, but with access quietly drying up until one day people realize the map has changed and nobody announced it because the announcement would have ruined the elegance of the move. And what makes this even more uncomfortable is the possibility that this is only the beginning. Because if these letters are real, or even partly real, then they do not just reveal one staffing adjustment or one estate revision, they reveal a mindset. They reveal William preparing for a monarchy that runs on his terms, with his discipline, his boundaries, and his memory of everything that came before. Which means the real shock is not that Camilla's side may feel rattled. The real shock is that this could be William's quiet rehearsal for something much bigger. A future in which sentimental ties matter less than control, and where the people who once assumed they were safely woven into the fabric of royal power suddenly discover they were only stitched in by a previous reign. And this is where the story stops feeling like a quiet adjustment and starts feeling like a slow, deliberate takeover that nobody can quite prove, but everyone can feel. Because once those letters entered the conversation, even as whispers, even as something denied, the atmosphere inside royal circles reportedly shifted. Not dramatically, not loudly, but in that subtle, suffocating way where people begin choosing their words more carefully, meetings feel slightly colder, and long-standing assumptions suddenly need to be rechecked. Because what if the rules have already changed and nobody told you? Because power inside these estates has never just been about land or money, it has always been about proximity, about who gets invited into decision-making spaces, who has influence over how properties are run, who gets to suggest, recommend, shape, and quietly steer outcomes without ever appearing in headlines. And if William has truly begun tightening that circle, narrowing it down to those he personally trusts, then what disappears is not just roles, it is access, it is influence, it is the invisible authority that once flowed so easily through certain family-linked connections. And insiders, the kind who never go on record but always know exactly where the tension lives, have allegedly been asking one very uncomfortable question: is this just modernization, or is this something far more personal dressed in the language of professionalism? Because the timing, the precision, the quiet nature of these shifts, they do not feel random. They feel intentional. They feel like someone who has studied the system for years and is now rewriting it without needing to announce that he is doing so. And that brings us to the most unsettling possibility of all. The idea that these letters are not just instructions, they are signals. Signals to those inside the system that the old pathways of influence are no longer guaranteed, that being connected to the right people from the previous era does not secure your place in the next one, and that loyalty, at least in William's version of the future monarchy, might be measured differently, not by history, not by association, but by alignment with his vision. Because think about what that means in practical terms. It means decisions that used to pass through familiar hands are now rerouted. It means recommendations that once carried weight are now questioned. It means individuals who once operated comfortably within the estate's inner mechanics are suddenly finding themselves outside the most important conversations, not removed publicly, not criticized, just absent. And in royal dynamics, absence speaks louder than accusation. What makes this even more delicate is Camilla's position itself, because on paper she remains secure. She stands beside the king. She carries her role with visible confidence. She appears integrated into the very heart of royal life, but power connected to estates, to private influence, to the unseen structure behind the monarchy, that power is not fixed, it shifts with control, and control right now is quietly consolidating elsewhere. And if William is already setting these boundaries before even becoming king, before fully inheriting the entire scope of royal private properties, then what happens when that transition eventually comes? Because these letters, if they truly reflect his thinking, suggest something much bigger than a present-day adjustment. They suggest preparation. They suggest that he is not waiting for the crown to reshape the system. He is starting now, which raises a question that nobody inside the palace would dare to ask out loud, but everyone is quietly thinking. When the next transfer of power happens, who will still have a seat at the table, and who will find that their influence belonged entirely to a past era that no longer exists? Because if this restructuring continues at the same pace, the answer may not come with a dramatic announcement. It may come the same way everything else has come so far, through silence, through absence, through doors that simply stop opening. And that is what makes this story linger, what makes it impossible to dismiss as just another piece of royal gossip. Because even if the letters themselves are never officially confirmed, even if no one steps forward to validate every detail, the pattern is there, the shift is visible, the movement is happening, and sometimes the most revealing thing is not what is proven, but what is quietly unfolding in plain sight, while everyone everyone pretends not to notice. Because at the center of all this is not just a prince managing estates, it is a future king defining control, drawing invisible lines, deciding what carries forward and what gets left behind, and in doing so, reshaping the monarchy in ways that may only become fully visible years from now. When the dust settles and people look back and realize that the transformation did not begin with the coronation. It began with letters, quiet, calculated, almost invisible letters that may have already rewritten more than anyone is ready to admit.